My name is Saleema Al-Samad. I am 42 years old, and until March 17, 2026, I believed I understood the exact architecture of the afterlife. I am a woman of habit, a woman of faith, and a woman who, on that Tuesday morning, was simply trying to navigate the humid air of downtown Chicago. I remember the weight of my favorite silk headscarf, the one with the bold black and white geometric patterns and the splash of mustard yellow, tucked neatly over my shoulders. I was wearing a crisp, blue linen button-down shirt. I remember the texture of the fabric against my skin because it was the last thing I felt before my nervous system began to unravel. I was standing near a concrete planter outside a glass-fronted office building, waiting for a rideshare. The city was loud, the kind of aggressive urban roar that you eventually stop hearing, but suddenly, the sound sharpened. It didn't fade, it became brittle. I felt a strange, cold flutter in my chest. Not a pain, but a displacement, like a gear slipping out of a groove. My vision didn't go black. Instead, it became hypersaturated. The gray of the sidewalk turned into a blinding silver, and the blue of my sleeves seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. I reached out to steady myself against the rough concrete of the planter, but my hand didn't seem to belong to me anymore. I watched my fingers, manicured and steady, refuse to grip the stone. Then came the thunderclap in my head. In medical terms, they later called it a subarachnoid hemorrhage, a spontaneous rupture of an aneurysm I never knew I carried. But in that moment, it wasn't a diagnosis, it was an eviction. I felt a massive, localized pressure behind my left eye, and then a sensation of being pulled backward through a very narrow straw. I heard my own breath hitch, a wet, shallow sound, and I saw the toes of my shoes hit the pavement. I wasn't falling, the world was simply moving away from me. I saw a man in a gray suit drop his briefcase and run toward me, his mouth moving in a silent shout. I wanted to tell him I was fine, but I was already observing the scene from a foot above his head. I saw my own body, dressed in that blue linen shirt, slumped awkwardly against the planter, my headscarf partially displaced. I wasn't scared. I was just profoundly, unnervingly detached. The transition from the sidewalk to the emergency department felt like a series of fractured camera cuts. One moment I was hovering over the sirens on Michigan Avenue, and the next, I was pressed against the ceiling of Trauma Room 4 at Northwestern Memorial. The lights were violent, fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low-frequency vibration I could feel in my non-existent teeth. Below me, a team of 6 people was working on the woman in the blue shirt. I watched them cut the fabric of my sleeve to start an interosseous line because my veins had collapsed. I saw the doctor, a young woman with exhausted eyes, shouting 4 milligrams of lorazepam and mannitol to bring down the intracranial pressure. It is a very specific kind of horror to watch your own mortality handled like a logistics problem. I saw the lead technician leaning over my chest, his hands locked, performing the rhythmic, brutal compressions that keep the blood moving when the heart has given up. I heard the ribs crack, a dry, snapping sound like kindling. And I felt a distant sympathy for the body that had to endure that. They had intubated me, a clear plastic tube was forced down my throat, and a machine was puffing air into my lungs with a mechanical hiss-click, hiss-click. I looked at the monitor. The EKG was a flat, green horizon. No peaks, no valleys. Just a steady, haunting drone that signaled the end of Saleema Al-Samad. I tried to look away, to find a door or a window, but the room began to dissolve. The beige linoleum floors and the stainless steel trays didn't fade, they peeled away like old wallpaper. The noise of the hospital, the shouting, the clatter of instruments, was replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like physical weight. I wasn't in a tunnel. I wasn't moving toward a light. I was simply standing in a space that felt like the moment before a storm breaks, expectant, charged, and terrifyingly vast. I was still wearing the blue shirt and the patterned scarf, but they no longer felt like clothes, they felt like memories I was still holding on to. I turned around, expecting to see the faces of my ancestors or the gates I had been taught about since childhood. Instead, I saw a man standing in the center of the emptiness. He wasn't a shadow, and he wasn't a ghost. He was more solid than the doctors had been, more real than the concrete planter in Chicago. And as he looked at me, I realized with a jolt of pure, cooling fear that everything I had been told about who would meet me at the end was wrong. The man standing there didn't fit the iconography I had memorized since childhood. He didn't look like a stained glass window or a Hollywood epic. He looked like someone who had just walked out of a dusty workshop in a Mediterranean heatwave. He was wearing a simple, coarse-woven tunic that was the color of unbleached wool, and his skin was the deep, weathered bronze of a man who spent his life under a relentless sun. But it was his eyes that pinned me to the spot. They weren't glowing, they were just devastatingly clear. They were the eyes of someone who knew the exact count of every hair on my head and every secret I had ever whispered into my pillow at 3 a.m. I tried to speak, to recite the Shahada, the declaration of my faith. But my tongue felt like lead. I wanted to tell him he was in the wrong place, that I was a woman of the Prophet, that there had been a celestial clerical error. "Saleema," he said. His voice didn't echo. It didn't boom. It resonated inside my chest cavity, vibrating the very atoms of the blue linen shirt I still felt I was wearing. It was a voice of absolute authority wrapped in a terrifying tenderness. I sank to my knees. The floor beneath us wasn't solid, yet I didn't sink. It felt like standing on the surface of a dark, still lake at midnight. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had prepared thousands of meals, the hands that had held my children, the hands that were currently being pumped by a cardiac technician in a trauma room miles away. They looked thin and translucent. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I already knew. The air around him smelled of cedarwood and rain. "I am the way you were told was a detour," he said. He didn't move closer, yet he was suddenly right in front of me. "I am the truth you were told was a fable. I am the life you are currently losing because you are looking for it in the wrong direction." I felt a surge of defensive anger, a survival instinct from my living self. I followed the laws, I stuttered. I gave the charity. I fasted. I kept the prayers. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flash of sorrow in his expression that was more painful than the aneurysm. "You followed the map, Saleema, but you refused to meet the king of the land. You traded intimacy for a checklist." He reached out a hand, calloused, scarred at the wrist with a mark that looked like a permanent, jagged crater, and touched the fabric of my headscarf. "You are dressed for a journey you haven't actually started." The scene shifted instantly. We weren't in the void anymore. We were in my younger brother's apartment in Skokie. I recognized the smell immediately. Burnt toast and overpriced cologne. It was 3 weeks ago. I saw myself, the living Saleema, sitting at his kitchen table. My brother, Omar, was crying. He was telling me about his divorce, about his struggle with depression, about how he felt like he was drowning in the expectations of our family. I watched my living self. I looked composed. My headscarf was perfectly pinned. My posture was rigid. I watched as I handed him a tissue and then, with a voice as cold as a February frost, I told him he needed to pray more. I told him his suffering was a result of his lack of discipline. I saw the look in Omar's eyes, the way the light went out of them, the way he physically recoiled from my wisdom. I hadn't offered him a hug. I hadn't offered to listen. I had offered him a lecture because it was easier than feeling his pain. "This is the righteousness you brought to me," the man, Jesus, said, standing beside me in the memory. "You used my father's name as a shield to keep from having to love your own blood. You turned your faith into a weapon of exclusion rather than a bridge of mercy." I felt a sickening jolt of self-confrontation. I wanted to scream at my past self to reach out and touch Omar's hand. But I just sat there in the memory, sipping tea and checking my watch. "The warning I am giving you, Saleema, is not about the fire you fear," Jesus said, his voice dropping to a low, intense frequency that made the kitchen walls tremble. "It is about the ice you have cultivated in your own soul. You think you are safe because you are correct. But the correct are often the furthest from the gate. If you go back, you will lose everything you think defines you." Your community will turn. Your family will call you a traitor. You will lose the respect of the people who look at your modest dress and see a saint. You will be stripped bare. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. The fracture has already begun. Your brother is at this very moment sitting in his car with a bottle of pills because the godly sister he went to for help gave him a rulebook instead of a savior. This is the weight of your silence. The kitchen in Skokie didn't just fade, it shattered like a sheet of ice struck by a hammer. One moment I was staring at my brother's slumped shoulders, and the next, I was back in that vast, weightless expanse, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was no longer still, it was charged, as if a massive electrical current was humming just beneath the surface of the dark water we stood upon. Jesus didn't move, but his presence seemed to expand until he was the only thing in my field of vision. The simple tunic he wore began to shimmer, not with light, but with a density that made the vacuum around us look thin and fake. "You ask why I have intercepted you, Saleema," he said, and his voice was no longer a whisper. It was a foundation. "You ask why the title of your life is changing today. It is because the Muslim woman you were is a shell you have outgrown, and the spirit you have ignored is the only breath that will sustain what comes next. You think your devotion is a currency. You think you are buying safety. But I am not a merchant. I am the architect." I felt a wave of terror, a visceral realization that every prayer mat I had knelt on was a shadow of this moment. "What happens now?" I stammered, my voice cracking. "Why me? There are millions of us. Why are you showing me this?" He stepped closer, and the heat radiating from him was like standing near a kiln. "Because 2026 is the year the facades crumble," he said, his eyes burning with a clarity that felt like a surgical strike. "The institutions you lean on, the mosques, the cathedrals, the structures of correctness, they are being hollowed out from the inside. I am appearing to those who are weary of the performance. I am confronting you because you are influential, Saleema. People look at your perfect modesty and they see a destination. But you are a dead end. If you return, you will tell them that the rituals are empty without the relationship. You will tell them that the Jesus they respect as a messenger is the king they have rejected as a savior. This is why the title of your story must be a scandal, because only a scandal can wake a sleeping soul." The environment shifted again, but this time it wasn't a memory. It was a projection of a future that felt as solid as granite. I was standing in the courtyard of our community center in Dearborn. It was a Friday afternoon, a few weeks from now. The sun was pale and weak. I saw myself, the returned Saleema, standing near the fountain. I looked older, my face etched with a fatigue that no makeup could hide. My blue linen shirt was wrinkled, and my headscarf was tied loosely, almost carelessly. I was surrounded by women I had known for 20 years. These were my sisters, my confidants, the women who looked to me for guidance on everything from Quranic interpretation to raising children. But the air between us was toxic. I watched as Zainab, my closest friend, took a deliberate step backward. Her eyes weren't filled with the usual warmth, they were narrowed with a sharp, jagged suspicion. "You're speaking like a madwoman, Saleema," the projected Zainab said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "You're saying he spoke to you? You're saying our fathers were wrong? You're bringing shame on your husband's house." I saw the other women begin to whisper, their huddles tightening, excluding me. It was a social execution. I saw the text messages on a phone screen, a blur of blue bubbles filled with words like traitor, apostate, and mentally unstable. I saw my own daughter, Layla, standing on the periphery of the crowd, her face flushed with a deep, burning embarrassment. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at her shoes, her hands trembling as she clutched her backpack. "This is the price of the truth," Jesus said, standing behind me in the vision. "When you speak my name as I truly am, the world you built will reject you. The social peace you enjoy is predicated on a lie. The tension you feel now, the knot in your stomach, the cold sweat, this is the reality of the cross. You will be an exile in your own home. You will lose the invitations, the respect, and the comfort of the familiar. They will call it a breakdown. I call it a breakthrough. He pointed toward my daughter. She is the one who will suffer most from your choice. Her marriage prospects will vanish. Her standing will be compromised. You must decide, is my life worth her reputation? Is the truth worth the fracture of your family? The vision of the courtyard didn't just fade, it curdled. The sunlight turned a sickly, bruised purple, and the faces of the women I loved began to distort, their mouths moving in silent, jagged accusations. Jesus stood in the center of this collapsing reality, his presence the only thing that remained solid. He looked at me, and I felt the weight of my own duplicity. I realized that my entire life had been a carefully curated performance of piety, a brand of holiness that was as hollow as a drum. Look at your bank account, Saleema, he said, and suddenly, the glowing interface of my banking app suspended itself in the air between us. I saw the numbers. The steady deposits from my modest wear consulting business, the halal investments, the charitable donations that I had always made sure were documented and praised. Then, I saw the numbers begin to bleed. I saw the contracts being cancelled. I saw the emails from brands I had represented for a decade, politely but firmly severing ties due to brand misalignment and theological controversy. You built a kingdom on a foundation of sand, he said, his voice stripping away my last layers of pride. You traded the eternal for the temporary. You wanted the crown without the thorns. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, not the physical rupture of the aneurysm, but a moral one. I thought of my husband, Hassan. I saw him sitting in our living room, the beautiful Persian rug beneath his feet, his face buried in his hands. He was a man of high standing, a board member at the local Islamic center. I saw him being asked to step down. I saw the whispers at the masjid, the way people would part like the Red Sea when he walked through the doors, not out of respect, but out of a desire to avoid the contagion of his wife's heresy. This is the fracture, Jesus said. It is not just a disagreement, it is a demolition. Your life as you know it is over. You will go back to a house that is no longer a home. You will be a stranger to the man you have slept beside for 20 years. Is my truth worth the wreckage of your reputation? The scene shifted back to the dark, infinite water. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy, it was expectant. Jesus walked toward me, and this time, he didn't stop until he was inches from my face. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the texture of his weathered skin, and the terrifying, beautiful depth of his gaze. You want to know why the title of your story is Muslim Woman Dies and Says Jesus Confronted Her, he said, and I felt the words settle into my bones like lead. It is because the labels you cling to are the very things keeping you from the Father. You call yourself a Muslim as if it is a shield, but I am the only shield that holds against the coming storm. 2026 is not just another year on your calendar, Saleema. It is the beginning of the great sifting. The world is darkening, and the religious systems of men are failing to provide the light they promised. He reached out and took my hand. His touch was warm, human, and devastatingly real. The reason I am confronting you, specifically you, is because the people in your circles are starving for a reality they cannot find in a textbook or a ritual. They are dying of thirst while standing in a dry well. You will go back, and you will tell them that I am not just a prophet in their book. I am the Word that was with God in the beginning. I am the sacrifice they think they can bypass through their own goodness. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, vibrating hum. What determines the outcome of a life is not the list of prayers completed or the modesty of the dress. It is the surrender to the one who took the blow you deserved. The outcome of your life is determined by whose righteousness you are wearing. Yours is a filthy rag, Saleema. Mine is the only garment that passes the gates. I looked at my blue linen shirt. In his presence, it looked like ash. You will tell them that I am coming for my own, he continued. And my own are not those who are correct, but those who are broken and have allowed me to mend them. You will be the warning. Your life will be the signal fire. They will hate you for it because you are a reminder of the choice they are refusing to make. But if you do not speak, their blood is on your hands. The dark water beneath us began to ripple, reflecting not the stars, but the flickering monitors of the hospital room I had left behind. Jesus held my gaze, and I felt the gravity of the threshold. This wasn't a gentle suggestion, it was a cosmic ultimatum. He wasn't asking if I wanted to be a better person, he was asking if I was willing to die to everything I had ever called mine. "The door is closing, Saleema," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of urgency that made my soul ache. "You can stay here. You can step into the peace you've never known, leaving behind the wreckage of a life built on performance. Or, you can go back. But if you go back, you go as a vessel of my spirit, not a guardian of your reputation. You will be the Muslim woman who saw the king, and that testimony will be the fire that burns down your comfortable world." I looked down at the ripples. I saw my daughter, Layla, sitting in the hospital waiting room. She was clutching her prayer beads, her knuckles white, her face puffy from crying. She was praying to a God she thought demanded her perfection, unaware that the very God she was pleading with was standing in front of her mother, offering a relationship instead of a religion. I thought of my brother, Omar, still sitting in that dark car in Skokie. "If I go back," I whispered, "will they believe me?" "Some will," Jesus replied, "and their lives will be saved. Others will call you a demon. You are not choosing their reaction, you are choosing your master. You cannot serve the approval of your community and the truth at the same time. The choice is a narrow bridge, Saleema. One foot in front of the other. Will you carry my name into the lion's den?" I looked at his hands, the scars that looked like windows into a depth of love I couldn't comprehend. I realized that my blue linen shirt, my status, and my correctness were just heavy weights keeping me from swimming. I reached out and touched the coarse wool of his tunic. "I'll go," I said, the words feeling like a physical sacrifice. "I'll tell them." The moment the words left my lips, the silence of the void was shattered by a violent, metallic roar. It wasn't the sound of the city, but the sound of life rushing back into a cold machine. The transition was agonizing. I felt the straw sensation again, but this time I was being forced through it toward a point of intense heat and pain. Thump. My chest arched off the hospital bed. The first thing I felt was the brutal, jarring impact of the defibrillator paddles. It felt like a bolt of lightning had been driven through my sternum, mapping out every nerve ending with fire. I tasted copper, the blood from where the intubation tube had scraped my throat. The sterile, chemical smell of the ICU flooded my senses, choking out the scent of cedarwood and rain. "We have a rhythm," a voice shouted. It sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "Sinus tatch. Pressure's climbing. Get a neurocheck, now." I tried to open my eyes, but the fluorescent lights were needles of ice. I felt the cold plastic of the ventilator tube in my throat, a gagging, intrusive presence that made me want to scream, but I couldn't even moan. My hands were strapped down. I felt the weight of the hospital blankets, heavy, scratchy, and overwhelmingly real. I lay there, the mechanical hiss-click of the ventilator the only thing keeping me anchored to the room. The doctors were moving around me, their faces blurred masks of professional relief. They thought they had saved me. They thought their mannitol and their electricity had won the day. They had no idea that while my heart was a flat line on their monitors, I had been standing on the surface of eternity, being told that my entire life was a lie. I looked toward the door. I saw the silhouette of my husband, Hassan, talking to a nurse. He looked small. He looked fragile. I felt a surge of pity for him, not because I was sick, but because of what I was about to do to his world. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting second, the smell of cedarwood returned, cutting through the scent of bleach. The warning wasn't coming. The warning was already here. The transition from the intensive care unit to a private recovery wing felt like a slow-motion descent into a reality I no longer recognized. My husband, Hassan, sat by my bed for 3 days, his face a map of relief and exhaustion. He kept talking about the miracle of the Northwestern medical team and the blessing of my survival. Every time he mentioned a blessing, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I stayed silent, the ventilator tube replaced by a raw, aching throat that made every word feel like swallowing glass. I wasn't just recovering from an aneurysm, I was mourning the woman he thought he was taking home. On the fourth morning, the first confirmation arrived. It wasn't a voice from the ceiling or a glowing sign. It was my brother, Omar. He walked into the room looking like a ghost, eyes sunken, shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a hooded sweatshirt. Hassan stepped out to get coffee, leaving us alone in the sterile, white-walled silence. Omar didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He just stood at the foot of the bed and stared at me with a terrifying intensity. I was in the car, Saleema, he whispered, his voice cracking. Tuesday morning. I had the bottle in my hand. I was done. I couldn't do the good Muslim son act anymore. I couldn't handle the weight of everyone's expectations. I felt the air leave my lungs. This was the scene Jesus had shown me, the one I had dismissed as a fever dream or a projection of guilt. And then, Omar continued, his lower lip trembling, I heard your voice. Not in my head, it was like you were sitting in the passenger seat. You didn't give me a lecture. You didn't tell me to pray. You just said, Omar, the king sees you. Don't go yet. He wiped a stray tear with the back of his hand. That was at 11:54 a.m. The nurse said that was the exact minute your heart stopped on the sidewalk. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. The medical monitors beeped in their rhythmic, indifferent way, but the world had shifted on its axis. The encounter wasn't a hallucination brought on by hypoxia. It was a recorded event in the fabric of time. I realized then that I couldn't hide. I couldn't go back to the fundraisers and the tea parties and pretend I hadn't seen the man with the scarred wrists. The Muslim woman in the blue shirt had died on that sidewalk, and whatever was sitting in this hospital bed was something entirely new. 2 weeks later, I was back in our home in Dearborn. The house smelled of lavender and expensive cleaning supplies, but it felt like a museum, a collection of artifacts from a life I had outgrown. Hassan was hosting a small dinner for the elders of our community to celebrate my miraculous recovery. I stood in front of the vanity mirror, pinning my headscarf with trembling fingers. I chose the same geometric pattern I had worn the day I collapsed. I walked into the dining room. The air was thick with the scent of lamb and saffron. 6 men, including the head of our local mosque, sat around the table. They looked at me with a mixture of reverence and pity. We are so grateful to the Almighty for your return, Saleema, the Imam said, his voice resonant and fatherly. A testament to a life of devotion. The room went silent, waiting for my humble alhamdulillah. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I looked at Hassan. He was smiling, his hand reaching out to touch my arm in a gesture of public affection. I didn't just return, I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the performative sweetness I had spent years cultivating. I was sent back. The smile on Hassan's face didn't disappear, it froze. I saw the confusion in the Imam's eyes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, handwritten note, something I had found tucked into the folds of my blue linen shirt when the hospital returned my clothes in a plastic bag. It wasn't my handwriting. It was a single sentence in Aramaic, a language I have never studied, yet I knew exactly what it said, the bridegroom is here. I saw him, I said, the words cutting through the social grace of the room like a blade. I saw Jesus. And he isn't who we said he was. He told me the institutions are failing. He told me the rituals are empty. He told me that 2026 is the year the facades crumble, and it starts with us. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was a vacuum. I watched the wine glass in Hassan's hand tilt slightly, red liquid spilling onto the white tablecloth, a small, dark stain that began to spread, unhindered. No one moved to clean it. No one spoke. In that moment, I saw the exact fracture Jesus had warned me about. I saw the look of pure, unadulterated fear in my husband's eyes, not for my health, but for his standing, for our safety, for the lie we had called a life. I looked down at the spilled wine on the white cloth. It looked like blood. I felt the weight of the secret I was no longer keeping, and for the first time since the sidewalk, I felt the cedarwood and rain. The bridge was gone. Behind me, the world was in flames. In front of me, there was only a narrow, dusty path and a man who promised nothing but the truth. I reached out and touched the damp, red spot on the table.
If this message felt important, it probably was. There are more stories like this, and they only get deeper. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored.